So today we're going to be going through the client info page, and the client info page has a lot of different tabs on it. Some tabs are for daily workflow use. Some tabs are for configuration type items, and some tabs are more for Nimbello use. So the very first tab on the client info is the buyer's table. The buyer's table contains the buyer ID or receiver, requester, warehouse ID, along with who that's going to direct to. So for PO invoices that are directing to a buyer, requester, or a warehouse receiver department, you would set up that information on this page and associate that with a user. So if you have a new user, let's say you have Jay Christner, you can also provide a warehouse code if you want to. You do not have to if you're not doing receiving. Your buyer ID would be either your buyer ID or your requester ID, depending on which one you are utilizing. And you would choose who to direct that to. The individual that you direct it to may or may not be the same individual that the buyer ID belongs to. If a user has left the company, changed position, anything like that, their buyer ID can be reassigned to another individual, either by setting it up or by editing an existing one. You cannot duplicate your buyer ID. You cannot duplicate your warehouse code. You can duplicate and have the same user assigned to multiple buyer IDs or warehouse codes. So when you're done, you click on Update. Now, anything that comes in for a purchase order with a buyer or requester ID of Jay Christner will be directed to Phil. You can also export this to Excel, and there is also a default PO manager that can be utilized as well for certain instances if you want that as well, and you can save that default. The next tab is tax details. This is a small use section that is very, very specific if you are in an area that has regular tax rate changes. This is not changes between locations. So if you have taxes in your area where it is regionally variable by county, by city, anything like that, this is not the table that will handle that for you. This is for if you are registering taxes against your purchase order and the tax rate changes at a time period. Then the calculation for is the tax applicable to the purchase order, is it within the correct percentage, is going to apply based on the invoice date to the applicable date in this table and the associated tax percentage. Your next tab is Import Details. This is going to show you for your master files that are coming in, and this can be configured for whichever files you have coming through, the date and time that the last file was imported. So if you have a lot of invalid purchase orders, or you can't find a vendor, for example, you can come to this table and you can look and see when the last time a file was received. If we're expecting to receive a file daily and you do not see that the last import date was within the current day or the previous day, then it would be an inquiry to Nimbello or your IT team as to is something wrong with the purchase order file or has it been sent, for example. So this is how you can keep track of the last time and the file name of the last master files that were sent from the ERP to Nimbello. The client details page is just some information. This is not connected to any other data. The only thing that this would possibly connect to is if you have electronic invoices coming in, then the client name, the address information here will show as the address for not the vendor, but for your address, the bill to address, on electronic invoices only. Logo upload is typically a one-time item. However, if you do have a logo change, you can change the logo yourself. You would simply browse for an image file, and once you have found the image file you want, you can upload that logo and it will replace the logo here in the top right corner. This is a fixed size area, and so if the logo does not appear accurately or distorted, you may need to choose a different image. You can also choose on whether the menu item, which is this section up here, is a fixed menu or whether it is a float menu. And if it is a fixed menu, then as you scroll up and down, the menu will stay at the very top where you can always see it and always get to it. The next tab is Alpha Directed To. This would only be applicable if you are utilizing the Alpha Directed To routing rules for PO invoices. The Alpha Directed To rule means that when an invoice goes to a rule that is utilizing that, if the vendor's name starts with an A, for example, then regardless of who the vendor is or who the buyer is, it would go to Phil. If it starts with a B, it would go to Brad, for example. And so for the rule that this is applicable to, the invoice would go based on its name to the individual chosen as the directed to. This is more typical where there are larger accounting groups who have the vendors separated alphabetically, and they want to continue with that process for anything that is going to AP. Your date setting tab is for your posting period. So at the end of the month, when you're doing your end of month posting, do you want to stop all exports? Meaning that on a specific date, which you will set in the GL date, on that specific date, the exports will stop exporting. So you will not get a new file, new invoice file into your ERP until this is either removed or the date is changed. You also have the option of stopping all invoices with a newer than date. So today is September 13th. If my date, my GL date is September 12th, then any invoice with a September 13th invoice date or newer would not export. Any invoice with a September 12th date or older would continue to export until this date is changed. These two options do not require any kind of programming. Your third option here for update posting date in export does require that the export that is going to your ERP has a location for posting date to be entered. Not all ERPs have that information. If your export has that and the import into the ERP can take that data, then you can choose the posting date that the invoices will have when they go into the ERP. So it could be the first of the month, it could be the end of the month, it can be whatever date you want that to be, but it will continue to be that date in every export until that date is changed. Our next tab is vendor terms. If the vendor terms code is coming in on the vendor master from the ERP, then the terms code can be entered in our system and associated to a number of days. We do not send back the due date with the invoice in most cases. Your ERP is going to continue to have its calculation for its due date, where you can do all of the things that you already have set up, that is not going to change. What this does is it allows for you to see a calculated due date based on the vendor terms. So if an invoice has a vendor terms of 15 days, or a vendor has a vendor terms of 15 days, then we can show you a calculated due date so that that vendor can be prioritized, you know when it's coming due, and so forth. If the terms code on the vendor is not set up, then it is defaulted to 30 days. Otherwise, it will take the number of days in the term days to the term code that is on that vendor and will give you a calculated due date based on that information. Our next tab is PO type. PO type is generally a one-time setup item, and it is identifying the different types of purchase orders that are coming in from the ERP. In typical, there's one, maybe two types of purchase orders. Sometimes there are multiple types of purchase orders. Each purchase order type can have whether it is a two-way or a three-way purchase order. A three-way purchase order means that the invoice is automatically going to require receiving to be available. A two-way purchase order type means that the invoice is automatically going to skip all receiving type PO rules. So that is the difference between the two-way and the three-way. Other ways that PO type might be used is for notifications going out to users for escalation, which we'll get to in one of the other tabs, as well as it could affect rules. So does a PO type apply to a specific PO rule or not apply to a specific PO rule, as well as a few other configurations that can be available based on PO type. The next tab is invoice settings. The left-hand side is what controls the invoice number and how the invoice number is formatted. So during the setup process, we will inquire as to how many max characters your invoice number coming into the ERP can be. Typical is 20. Some ERPs do only accept as few as 10 or 8 digits in the invoice number field. If the invoice number coming in is more than the set number of characters, you can choose on whether you want to retain the leftmost characters, so the first 20 characters, or if you want to retain the rightmost characters, so the last 20 characters. And we can also choose if any special characters are going to be included as part of those number of characters. So you can choose to keep all special characters, you can choose to strip all characters, or you can choose to have just specific special characters allowed. As a note, if you're doing anything with an invoice image export, where the image is a PDF at any point, then the recommendation is to go with no special characters. If you do still want to retain some special characters, then things like slashes or asterisks or anything that would be not allowed in a file naming convention, a Windows file naming convention, will need to be automatically stripped from the invoice number. The reason being is when that PDF is created, if it has one of those special characters, we either have to strip that and therefore it no longer matches your invoice number in your data, or it's going to create a failure and will not be able to create that invoice image. The right-hand side has to do with your escalations. So your escalation days for PO and non-PO are going to be in days, and it is how many days an invoice is going to sit without an action before an escalation email is sent. So, for example, a action would be an update, a comment, a new hold reason, an approval, something like that, that moves the invoice to a new user, leaves a comment, updates the comment history, something such as that. So if an invoice sits for X number of days without an action, then an escalation email will be sent out. The escalation email will be sent for PO invoices to the user that the invoice is directed to, as well as the user for the PO type that is marked as the escalation user. So in the case of a PO type that is an NON PO type, the user John Smith would get a singular email for anything that is in his queue for that escalation period, as well as every other user who has a NON PO type in their queue at the escalation period. That way it allows for visibility to invoices that are not moving through. And John, presumably being a manager or supervisor, would be able to follow up with those users as to why the invoices are still out there. For non-purchase order invoices, the escalation email will go to the user it is directed to, as well as the next person in the approval structure. So that next person in the approval structure will not only get anything that's in their queue, but also anything that's in a queue below them. And the email will show them that information as well. The next tab is the holiday list. This can be used in conjunction with those escalation emails to help calculate the days since last action. So if you are regularly closed down for 2 weeks over the December holidays, then you can enter those dates as holiday dates. Those dates are automatically excluded from the escalation process as non-work days. So if you want to not have emails go out during that time period, you can enter those holiday dates in here, and then the days since last action will not include those dates. The image setting tab is also generally a one-time setup, and this has several bits of information in it that may or may not be used depending on what it is, what functionality you are using. So the first set here is all pertaining to what is going to export if you are doing an image export. And this would be an image export either just as a straight PDF or out to a repository system that you are handling on your side and maintaining on your side. So the first item is a image count. So how many are we going to allow to export at any given time? The second one is the naming format. So there are options for the naming format that can include vendor name, vendor number, the invoice number, the purchase order number, the invoice total, or the invoice ID. The invoice ID is a SQL ID number that is associated to the invoice when it imports into the Nimbello system. It creates a 100% unique identifier. And this can be a two-piece setting. So you have the same options on both sides of the equation. So your file name will be one of these options dash one of these options dot PDF will be what the file naming is. In the package, the image package that we are sending out, you can choose to have different things included. Automatically included is of course, the original image of the invoice. That will always be out there. But you can choose to have other things included as well. One of which is any supporting documentation. So on the invoice details page, there is the option to add additional images for supporting documentation to the invoice. You can choose to have those exported as a secondary page to the original invoice. You can also choose to export the comment history image. So the print comment history page, in addition to showing on the invoice details, can be included as a third page to the image export. So it'd be original image, supporting documentation if you're doing that, and then the comment history. And finally, you can also include the geocoding as well for non-PO invoices. You can also export as a fourth page option, the geocoding as an image in that export as well, that image export. So those would all go out as a singular image package, not four separate images, but a singular PDF that would include all of those items together. As far as viewing the invoice, many individuals choose when they click on View Invoice to include the original image and then the backup documentation as a singular PDF. It is a dynamic concatenation at the time that you hit the View Invoice image that will pull the original image and dynamically attach any supporting documentation so that when you're viewing the invoice, all of that is, again, a singular PDF at the time that you were viewing that image. And that can happen automatically if the attach supporting invoice image option is on. We can also choose what statuses, if you are exporting the images, what statuses that invoice image will export on. In typical, that's going to be posted and manual. However, there are some instances for certain ERPs that it needs to be a status other than that. And so we can choose which statuses that image will export out on. Our next tab is the division setup. The division setup is not used for all clients. This will only be applicable if you are using the division process. The way the division process works is it is a logical separation within a singular tenant, so a singular database that gives a logical separation between different locations, different departments, or other types of separation that is necessary. The separation would either facilitate different export files as is necessary for some ERPs, or it could just be for security purposes to keep locations separate for what users can view and what they have access to. If the division process is turned on, then each invoice will need to be assigned to a division. The divisions that they can be assigned to will be set up in the division table here. So when you click on Add, you can add a new division, division code, and up to 6 extension type items. The division extensions can be a programmable segment in which it could either affect something regarding the export, it could affect something regarding the workflow, or it could have other options available to it depending on what is needed. These are additional programmable fields that would require development in order to have them associated with any type of automatic process. The divisions, when the invoices import, can be assigned to divisions based on the purchase order or based on something within the invoice. If the purchase order or invoice cannot be identified for a division, then there will be a default division assigned that the invoices will go to, and somebody will need to manually move it to the appropriate division at that point. Users can also be associated with divisions. And if using division processing, will need to be associated with divisions in order to be able to see invoices. If a user does not have access on the user setup page to a division, then they cannot see anything regarding invoices in that division. Divisions can also be assigned to division groupings. So if you have a grouping of users that need to, or if you have a user that needs to have access to a grouping of divisions, then instead of assigning the individual ones, you can assign it at a group level. This just helps with ensuring that access is always available. And if you make a change to a division group, all users associated with that group are automatically updated with that new access. The next tab is the self-assessed tax code assignment. And the way this works is only if you are using self-assessed tax, and only if you are using multiple options of self-assessed tax. So you can give the tax a code description, and you can assign the GL that's applicable to it. And so you may have an account for California and an account for Washington. And depending on the invoice or the location that the invoice is for, the self-assessed tax may need to be assigned to one GL versus the other GL. You can do so then on the invoice details page and assign the appropriate self-assessed tax as well as the appropriate descriptions and amounts and so forth. The next tab is the vendor division tolerance. This is in regards to the purchase order pricing and extended amount variance. The way this works is that you will choose a vendor. So I'm going to choose a vendor, and I would then choose a division if division functionality is turned on. Division functionality does not have to be turned on to use this option. Division functionality in this does allow for if, for example, fluid system components is part of multiple divisions, but you only want a variance in the pricing or extended amount to apply to one of those or two of those, or they need to be different across them. This can happen if you have a vendor that is in a volatile pricing industry, in which case you may want to have a higher variance allowed for them than you would other vendors. Or it's the opposite where there shouldn't be any variance where you normally would allow some. And so you choose the vendor, division if applicable, and you choose whether this is going to be at the price or the extended price. If it is a two-way type vendor, you will fill in the two-way dollar and or percentage that you want associated. If it's a three-way vendor, meaning it requires receipts, you will fill in the three-way variance that you want to associate. So in this case, I can say that I want a $15 variance, but that can be no more than 5% over what the purchase order is. And if the price is under the purchase order, I don't want to accept any price under the purchase order. And so I'm going to set those both at 0. And when I save that, it does require a division for me to save this. When I save that, this invoice for fluid system components will then follow this variance structure versus whatever the standard variance structure that was already set up. So you can make this less stringent or more stringent than what your standard setup has been set for. Your next tab is SSO. This stands for single sign-on. This is not available for client configuration. This has to be configured by Nimbello. This is the information that will be worked on with your network team in order to set up the single sign-on, pass the certificate information, and so forth. Your next tab is your standard comment tab. Standard comments show in the standard comment dropdown on the invoice details page. This is where you can set up the information for standard comments. You will give it a short name and you will give it a description. In your description, you cannot use HTML coding. HTML coding includes characters such as the greater than, less than, the double slashes, breaks, anything like that are not allowed in the description. The reason being is that HTML coding can allow for injected code that can cause security questions. And so HTML coding is restricted from your general functions of the website in order to help facilitate the security of not having injected coding. So when you are doing your description, you can do any formatting you want so long as it's not HTML encoding. If you want to edit an existing or delete an existing, you can do so at the bottom, and you can edit it directly in the field itself. What any standard comment that is entered is available for any user to see and utilize. This is not just an AP function. AP can set up the standard comments, but the use of the standard comments can be used by any individuals within the site. Currency exchange is our next tab. This is utilized only for non-PO approval conversion. The exchange rate is not used to recalculate the invoice totals, and it is not used currently for purchase order pricing validation. Okay. Purchase order pricing is still going to be compared as a number on the purchase order to a number on the invoice. If the two are in different currencies, then it will come up as a variance. For non-purchase order invoices, if a vendor is set up with a specific currency, then we will come to this rate exchange table and we will look to see what the exchange rate is against that currency compared to the base currency. In this case, the base currency is USD. If the base currency is euros or yen or anything like that, then it will be compared against that base currency. The exchange rate then is what is used for the approval calculation. So when you approve a non-PO invoice, it will state that the approval amount is X amount compared to X dollar amount. And so if there is an exchange, it will tell you what the US amount is that the approval is for in this example. That way you don't have to have multiple different approval groups or dollar levels, amount levels available to handle different currencies. The exchange rate will update that for you so that you can utilize a singular grid. The exchange rate is manually updated. So if your exchange rate is very volatile and you need to have it updated on a daily basis, then my suggestion would be to have a data import for it. Otherwise, if you only check it once a month, then my suggestion would be to go ahead and update it when it needs to be updated. So our next tab is the vendor division approval. This is for non-purchase order invoices on doing an auto approval, auto geocode auto approval. So the first thing you will do is choose your vendor. You can then choose a allocation that will go to. Your allocations are set up in the non-PO setup, and those are AP controlled. So you would choose the allocation that you want the invoice to geocode to. An allocation can be a single GL or it can be multiple GLs. For the approval amount, you can choose to override the amount, meaning it doesn't matter what the dollar amount of the invoice is, it's going to automatically approve. Or you can say that you only want it to automatically approve between certain dollar amounts. So it may only be able to be approved, for example, between $100 and $150. In which case, if the invoice is below 100 or above 150, it's going to go to an approval group to be reviewed. It will still auto geocode, but it will go to an approval group at that point in order to be validated as to why the invoice is outside of the standard amount that is expected. When you save this, it will provide that information in the grid down here. Again, if you were doing this based on divisions, you would choose the vendor and the division that this is applicable to. If you want it to auto approve for all divisions, you will have to set the invoice up for each division in order to do that auto coding. The next tab is a settings list tab. This is a customizable settings list. So this can be used for various items that may need to be controlled at a client level. There is no standard programming that is developed off of this particular settings list. This is utilized specifically for custom coding, whether it be GL approval. It could be for specific items that affect the export, so forth. It is just an open settings list that can be utilized and edited as necessary by clients for whatever function has been determined needs that particular setup.